that is, previously slaves in Europe came from through Turkish slave traders from southern Europe, so from Ukraine, the southern Caucasus, Crimea, the Balkan areas. And they were transported to Italy, mostly Italy and Spain and Portugal. And then Spain and Portugal found these islands up the coast of Africa, Cape Verde Islands and the Canary Islands. And what they could do on these islands was grow sugar, which you couldn't grow really anywhere else in Europe. And so they were transporting slaves from these Turkish traders all the way to the Cape Verde Islands and the Canary Islands. And then there was a Frenchman who came, and he was a mercenary, and he had been hired by the Portuguese. And his name was Jean de Grandcourt. That's not necessarily important, but I can remember these things. And he came up with this idea. He said, why are we transporting slaves from Muslim traders in Turkey, who are our enemies, when we can go to the African coast and get them easier, right? And so this starts chattel slavery from the African coast to these islands. So in 1492, when Spain discovers or stumbles upon the Caribbean, they realize they can grow sugar here because it's a very good climate for growing sugar. And so what they do is they take the model from the Cape Verde Islands and they bring it to the Caribbean. And so they start shipping slaves from the West African coast to the Caribbean and Latin America as they expand further into the mainland. Now the English are not involved in this slave trade at this point. Spain is their enemy, and so they start by, has anybody heard of Sir Francis Drake? Right? He raids Spanish gold ships with gold, because on top of the sugar they're also mining gold and silver, mostly silver, from the mainland, from Mexico and Peru, through forced slave labor of indigenous peoples, the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas and so forth. And so the British initially just start raiding these gold ships, and it's very lucrative for them. It's a very low budget way of making war against Spain, who is the primary enemy. But in 1655, things change. The Spanish surrender the island of Jamaica to the British. And so all of these former pirates, what do? They use the gold that they're stealing to buy land in Jamaica and set up sugar plantations. And that sugar, and then they have a monopoly on sugar trade back to England. It's very, very lucrative. So English merchants then become involved in trading slaves. Now, one of the reasons they find that lucrative is because the cost of capturing a slave on the West Africa, or buying a slave on the West African coast, and you transfer it to America, you can make 8 times the value of that person by transporting it to Jamaica. And at the same time, you have a movement, a religious movement in England called the Puritans, separatists. They don't like the Church of England very much. And Elizabeth I and James I absolutely hates them. They hate them. They can't stand them. So what they do is they decide they're going to dump them in North America. And so their ship gets blown off course on their way to Virginia, and they wind up in Massachusetts. And so they found their colony there. So England starts this policy of shipping people that they don't like to Massachusetts and Virginia, which is a convenient place to dump them. And so what you have is a developing economy and culture of dispossessed English people. And then in the southern colonies, they find you can grow tobacco, right? And so in order to grow tobacco, you need lots of workers who will work for very low wages, or no wages. And so then they bring that model of bringing slaves to Jamaica to the southern colonies, to Virginia, Maryland, and in those days it was still the Carolinas. There wasn't a lot of and so they started bringing slaves to the colonies. Now, another way to get labor into the colonies was through people they didn't, another group of people they didn't like in England. In Great Britain, the larger islands of Scotland, Wales, England, Ireland, they didn't like Celts. They didn't like Catholics. And so what they would do is they'd show up in places in Ireland and Scotland and burn the towns down, and then force all of the people onto boats and bring them to the New World, and to pay off their debt for being transported to the New World, they had to sign what's called an indenture contract, which meant that they were a slave. They were the property of whoever their sponsor was for a period of 7 years or so. That continued into the 1690s, into the early 1700s. And what happens particularly in Virginia, and Johnny was talking about this earlier with plantation politics, this emerges at a very specific point in the history of Virginia. The indentured servants and slaves who had become freed through manumission, which is where a slave owner dies and he frees his slaves at the end of when he dies in his will. So there emerged in Virginia this population of free blacks and these Irish and Scottish immigrants who intermarried, not just white men and African women, but African men and Irish and Scottish women, and developed this whole culture in Virginia. And in 1675, they rose up in a rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion. And it really, really scared all of the British colonial leaders in all of the colonies. And so what they did is they took the whites in that rebellion and said, we will give you what you want. And they didn't give the Africans what they wanted. Once the division had been made, the rebellion was put down and there was no more force left in the colony. One important thing to keep in mind about this moment is, it's an amazing moment of organizing across color lines, right? That they're both poor whites and poor blacks are rising up. But one of the first things that they wanted was Indian land. There was no solidarity with indigenous peoples in the movement. And so this creates what Johnny was talking about, the idea of plantation politics, right? That you divide poor whites from poor blacks, and they fight over the resources, the meager amount of resources that you put. This is still the policy today, in the United States. Canada's a little different story. And so, as the colonies get more successful, they're more economic, but economic success comes from slaves, comes from tobacco and later cotton. Okay? So when we get to I'm going to skip ahead to 1860 for a second. Okay? In 1860, if you added up the value of everything in the North, every chair, every barn, every cow, every dog, every pig, every chicken, every window pane, right? It wouldn't be the North. It wouldn't even have a quarter of the wealth that the actual value of slave property, the people themselves were. Even if you take out, like the value of cotton once it's produced and sold, the actual value of slaves was that much greater than any economic resource in the North. And so this brings us to abolition. So how did abolition beat that? Right? So how did they do that? Like, today we think of corporations and all of that wealth, right? We think that's a lot of money, right? But that wealth has existed in history before, and it was beaten. Right? So how did they do it? So the Puritans, as they sort of took over the colonies in sort of Massachusetts and most of New England, that became the economic, in the early colonial period, that was the main hub of economic power, because everything that was made had to leave by ships, and those ships, last stop was in Boston, because Boston was the closest harbor to England. And when you sail on ships and it takes a month to cross, you have to get all the supplies you can. So the Protestant Christian identity was very important in the early republic, in the colonies and in the early United States Republic, from the 1780s to the Civil War period, when Catholics started to come in and take all of that. And in 1800, there was a very big revival in the Protestant churches. It's called the Second Great Awakening. And it took two different phases. In the North, it began at Yale by the grandson of the leader of the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards. And it was very academic, it was very intellectual, experience of the Gospels and so forth. But in the South, it was very, not just anti-intellectual, but it was emotional